Okay, I'm just gonna basically kind of skim through my notes, so I apologize if I kind of look off down to the side and try to pick back up. I'll try to be as smooth as I can. And I'm gonna give you a week one overview of the readings. I'll try to do this every week. I'll try to just give you kind of a little overview of what we're doing each week, so you kind of have an idea of what to expect and kind of what to look for. And of course, I'll give you a transcript for this video, and then there's always going to be a little summary description of the week as well. So you have a few different modes and mediums for digesting the course material. Okay, so we'll start with Harvard and the late 1800s. That is where composition began. So in the late 1800s, 1870s actually, um, there was a guy named Charles Eliot. He was the president at Harvard at the time, and he hired this guy named Adams Sherman Hill, who's basically credited with creating the first composition program, composition course. His book, The Principles of Rhetoric, I gave you a little screenshot of it and a link to it, and you can read a little bit of it this week. Is basically the first composition textbook ever. It was used to teach composition at Harvard for like the first couple decades, and it was modeled and used to teach comp, across the country for decades. I mean, honestly, up until the 60s, probably the 1960s. So before I keep going with Harvard, I'm just going to jump in and say that at this time there was another thing that was going on. The German model for universities was taking root in America. So a lot of students were leaving the United States in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, all the way up until the early 1900s. And they were getting educated in the German university system, and they were coming back and using that to build education paradigms here. And the German model is the research university. So the research university, as you know it today, is basically the German model. It basically emphasized research, empiricism, objectivism, positivism, all these isms. But basically, the graduate school, graduate research, research in general was heavily emphasized, and teaching was sort of de-emphasized. The German model brought you lectures, where the American model was like recitation and drills. So big changes in education systems and paradigms in general were happening while the very first composition program was being developed. So back to Harvard in the late 1800s, about 1876, 78, right around there. Adam Sherman Hill takes over. He's a journalist. He's a lawyer. He's a language purist. He's upset with mass media culture. He thinks it's making everyone stupid. He thinks that the language of the mass media culture, the new informal discourse of journalism, is threatening the sort of scholarly elite academic discourses. And Sherman Hill kind of uses the university and the comp program to kind of push back against that and to continue to privilege and value that kind of elite language purity. So the first theory that we're going to look at in this course is current traditional paradigms for teaching composition, and that's basically a product of Adams Sherman Hill School, where current traditional rhetoric is built off of formalism. You're looking at stylistic correctness. You're looking for exposition, narration, argumentation. Formalistic, stylistic, grammatical purity. Good writing is the product of genius. The rest is basically errorless prose, right? I would say that current traditional paradigms see writers as being genius and able to produce errorless prose. So again, That is the current traditional paradigm. That's a product of the Adams Sherman Hill school in the late 1800s. Um, and you'll see when you read over some of the materials from that school or that era, you'll start to see that kind of language purity focus kind of manifest itself. Okay, I'm going to come down and just check my notes right here so I stay on track. Okay, so another thing Hill did, he invented placement exams. So in the readings this week, the John C. Brereton reading, you'll notice that everyone blames the prep schools, right? Like everyone basically says we shouldn't teach comp, we shouldn't have to teach comp. High schools aren't preparing kids to write for Harvard, right? Basically, Adam Sherman Hill was complaining that prep schools weren't preparing kids to write for Harvard, whatever that meant. But anyway, they all sort of, banded together and complained about prep schools' inability to prepare students. And so he made a placement exam. And basically, his placement exam was like uh, based off of a bunch of literature that you had either read or hadn't read. So if you hadn't read the literature, you weren't going to pass. And then eventually, the placement test became a list of books that you should read to pass the test. But really, the placement test was, I think, honestly, a tool to force prep schools to try to prepare students to write better. Although you'll see that that doesn't really matter. You're gonna learn a lot of things in this class that are probably gonna surprise you a bit and make you wonder why things are still the way they are, or maybe wonder why some of the experiences you had you still had, given the research and knowledge that you know was already available. Okay, so placement exams, he invented those. Again, he was a language purist. Really current traditional pedagogies. Um, that was his thing. That's what Harvard was about during that time. And this week, in John Barrington's work, that's the origins of composition studies in the American College from 1875 to 1925. You'll read the introduction starting on page 3, and then you'll read some of chapter 2, which is the first writing program at Harvard. It starts on page 26. Um, you'll see there's a lot of primary materials in Brereton's book. It's like 600 pages of primary research materials. So don't get too frustrated when you're kind of skimming and scanning some of those documents. But they're really good for understanding kind of the mindset of writing programs during the time and how this all started and why it all started. And then you'll also read a piece from Ryan Skinnell on normal schools and writing programs. And so I thought this would be interesting because Central Washington University started as a normal school in 1891. So I study writing programs and the history of composition programs, and I thought it would be interesting to maybe bring in some of the work I've done looking at the history of writing programs here into the class so we can kind of see how the history of writing programs sort of nationally in American universities kind of parallel with what happened here. So in 1891, Washington State basically became part of the Union and designated land for a normal school. Normal schools were built to train teachers. So after the Civil War, a bunch of people were now able to get educated, and there were more and more people going to school, K through 12 schools. So we needed more teachers, and so normal schools were basically, teacher training schools. So CWU started as a normal school. So I thought it might be interesting to read Skinnell's piece because it talks about normal schools and writing programs. And then I thought it could be interesting to look over some of the primary materials from the Washington State Normal School that I have, and I put into some links. So I looked at some special collections catalogs here and basically screenshotted some course descriptions and some curriculums. And we can look over those and think about, what was CWU doing at the time in relation to what Harvard was doing and other schools were doing, and how this whole idea of composition and writing programs was starting and growing and developing. So after you read Skinnell's piece, you can look over the introduction and the first chapter of Adam Sherman Hill's Principles of Rhetoric. That's basically the first handbook to teach composition. So that'll be interesting to look at too. And then you can look over some of the Washington Normal Schools materials. And then just remember, you don't need to read every single word. You don't need to know every single thing from these materials. A lot of this is get the gist of what's going on. Use your rhetorical reading skills, right? What's the purpose? Who is the author? What's his expertise? What's he study? What's his background? What is he doing here? Why is he writing this thing? Just try to get the gist of some of these pieces. Many times I'll tell you something to read, extra carefully. But in grad school, there's going to be so much material to cover. You have to learn how to skim and scan a little bit. So remember, there's lots of materials in here that you can just sort of get the gist of, and then read some of the other stuff more critically. And then when you see certain areas that you find particularly interesting or relevant, make sure that you read those extra carefully. Okay, so that's your reading discussion response. And another thing that I wanted to say about your response is you don't have to respond to every student every week. The goal is to use these responses in the final project to basically come back and reference and cite each other's responses, to basically use the work from the course to develop our own final projects. So I think it's more effective to actually use each other's reading responses to develop our final projects than to just keep going back and just to respond. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about this in the introduction video, but you need to think of your reading responses as resources for your classmates to use and to reference and to cite in their final project. So when you're, writing these up, make sure you're thinking about your classmates and how you could provide them information and summaries and analysis and ideas that they could actually take and use and build on. And again, I'll talk more about that in future videos. So, okay, let's see. Sorry, just jumping down here to my notes. Okay, and then after you've read everything, just make sure that you write down some critical questions. Remember, the critical questions are really important. I use your questions to engage you, to have a conversation with you about the readings. Since we don't get to talk a lot in class, you're going to have questions about the readings. You're going to have questions about the theories and the material. And I want to engage those questions. I want to answer those questions. I want to have time to think about those questions and to provide you good answers. So please take your time with the questions. Make sure you're asking sincere, critical questions that you actually want more information on. And then after you're done with the questions, just write up your response, and then you can post it by the end of the day Sunday. I figured I would give you by the end of the day Sunday. That way, if you have a schedule, you can just figure out what day works best for you. If you needed to post every Tuesday, then you could set up your schedule like that. If you need to organize your week accordingly, that's the goal, is to try to give you as much room and space to kind of set your own schedule up. So again, this week we're looking at Harvard's very first composition program and course. We're looking at Adam Sherman Hill a little bit. We're looking at current traditional paradigms for teaching. So again, just kind of starting to figure out, where did all of this come from? Why did all of this come about? And so we'll start there, and then we'll just kind of move through the history of composition kind of linearly. I think that'll just keep it easier for us to manage because there's just so much information. Okay, well, good luck with this week's reading. If you have any questions about any of the readings, please let me know. Otherwise, I really look forward to reading your responses. I really look forward to reading your questions and engaging your questions. So have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.